So we're looking at the gospel in every single book of the Bible, and we come to the little book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is, I think, in some ways, very, very delightful. When people read it, they feel like they are learning, they're inspired. People love to preach about it. I also think it's a little dangerous because it's pretty easy to read the book of Ruth the way you would read an Aesop's fable. Just a great story of faithfulness and virtue on the part of Ruth, and not to see how it fits into the storyline, because what we're trying to do in every one of these books is ask the question, what's the book about? How does it fit into the storyline of the Bible and move that storyline along? How does it point to the gospel of grace? And how does it actually point us to Jesus himself? It's very easy to miss that with the book of Ruth because it's so attractive in so many ways. How so? Well, as you know, the story of Ruth is about a Jewish family, an Israelite family, that during a famine moves out of Israel to Moab in order to survive. And when they're there, the two sons and they grow up and they marry Moabite women. But then disaster happens. And not only is the father of the family, does he die, but both the sons die. And that leaves Naomi, the mother and wife, alone with two Moabite daughter-in-laws. Then she finds out that the famine is done in Israel, and she decides to go back, and she turns to her two daughters-in-law and said, look, I love you, but the fact is, if you come back in here, if you come back with us, you'll be foreigners, you'd be outsiders, you'd be single women in a pretty brutal culture. You're much more likely to find husbands and have a good life if you stay with your families and you stay here. And so one of the two women says fine and goes back. But as you know the story probably, Naomi has another daughter-in-law named Ruth, who's, yes, she's a Moabitess, but she says, I want to stay with you. I love you. And your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And so she comes back with Naomi, and they are living in total poverty, and they have no family. But what ends up happening is Ruth accidentally, as it were, starts to go out to glean the way poor people did, the way poor people in Israel were allowed to go and glean grain out of the fields of people who they would take it home and they could make bread and do that sort of thing. So the poor were allowed to glean. And she ends up going into the field of Boaz, who actually, according to Israelite law, could be a kinsman redeemer. Now, the key to the entire story is the fact that, according to Israelite law, a kinsman redeemer was a near relative of somebody who died, Naomi's husband, and he was able then to buy the land that belonged to Naomi's husband at a pretty great price. But then, ordinarily, the kinsman redeemer would also have to marry the wife of the dead person, and the children of that man, of the wife, that would come out would not be in the man's name, but in the name of the dead person. So a kinsman redeemer would say, here's my relative, John, but John dies and leaves behind his wife, Susan. So a kinsman redeemer could come in and take over all the land of John and marry Susan, but their children would be John's children, not the kinsman redeemer's children. So it was a way for dead men to have someone who could continue their line. It turns out that Boaz decides to do this for Ruth and for Naomi. And as a result, he redeems them, he marries Ruth, they have children, and one of the children is the grandfather of David the king. So now what's all this mean? Okay, number one, this story is wonderful because it talks about how God's in charge of everything, that even things that look like accidents, this is God working. Number two, it tells us that Ruth was just a faithful, loving woman who just did the right thing, and it turned out great. Number three, how does this fit into the storyline of the entire Bible? What's interesting here is Ruth and Naomi have a problem. They are poor and they have no family. Boaz comes in and he's able to put them into a family and bring Ruth into who was excluded because she was a foreigner, into into a family. And that's really, really wonderful. But guess what? The way in which they did it brought the king of Israel. In other words, Ruth and Naomi were being redeemed, but so was Israel, because Israel, as we know, needed a king. That's the last thing we read at the end of the book of Judges. See, if you read Judges, the last thing it says is, it's not going to work unless we have a king. And as soon as you get to Ruth, you see how God brought about a king, because Ruth ends up being the great grandmother of David the king. So in a sense, Israel is being healed and given what Israel needs, and so is Ruth and Naomi being given what they need, which is a family. You know, it's interesting, there's only 85 verses in the book of Ruth, but 23 times the word redeem shows up. And that's really how you should preach or read the book of Ruth. Ruth is pointing forward to the ultimate kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ, who, because he became a human being, is in a sense our kinsman, but because he went to the cross, is our redeemer. And so, because she was the great-grandmother of David, ends up being one of the mothers of Jesus. And in Jesus' genealogy, in Matthew chapter 1, you see Ruth is one of the people that brought Jesus Christ into the world, as it were. And what we really like about the genealogy there is when you see Ruth, who was an outsider. She was a racial outsider, yet she's brought on in, and she becomes one of the mothers of Jesus. So it doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter Rahab is also in the genealogy. She was a prostitute, right? So it doesn't matter your record. It doesn't matter your race. If you believe, if you put your faith in the God of Israel, then God can work through you, and you can be part of God's family. The way we need to all be redeemed is to be put into a family. So you've got to be careful not to just look at Ruth as a kind of wonderful moralistic story about how, we should just love one another and be faithful. But you have to see that Ruth was actually being used by God to move the storyline along, to bring David, and who points to the ultimate king, Jesus Christ.